I talk all over the country on climate change, and normally there's like two parts to my talk, right? The part you just heard that I have to give, and then there's the part that I give. So I am so grateful for these three scientists behind me to have represented the scientific perspective already, but I feel a little constrained to limit my comments to theological and ethical comments. But I'll do my best, and maybe in the Q&A we'll go back and forth a little bit. Let me begin by answering this question that was asked of me. Greg put to me a few questions to answer. The first is, what are the broad ethical issues raised by the evidence we've just seen on climate change? And the first is that climate change represents a triple injustice. First of all, climate change hits the poorest people first and worst. Secondly, those most affected by climate change did not cause it and are powerless to affect it. And third, those who are profiting from the extraction of fossil fuel are not paying the full costs. We'll get to that more in a moment. The second broad ethical issue is humanity's inadequate focus on and acceptance of intergenerational responsibility. We have an economic system that at best has a 3-month outlook, and what we need is an economic system that has a 7-generation outlook. I have challenged our pastors that if you or your partner is pregnant, 100% of your sermons during that pregnancy should at least touch upon intergenerational responsibility. And often they look at me and they say, what, have you forgotten all the theology that you learned in seminary? And it turns out Scripture is full of an emphasis on intergenerational responsibility, but because we have such a short time horizon, focusing on current generation profits, we ignore intergenerational responsibility. That's the second broad ethical issue. The third is our relationship to and our attitude toward nature. Our current understanding of capitalism is insufficiently comprehensive. Our implementation of capitalism requires economic externalities for the market to work. Economic externalities are those aspects that are not considered part of the market system. And so everything we've heard in the past 40 minutes about the impact of CO2 as a consequence of burning fossil fuels over the past 200 years, none of that has ever been factored into capitalist profit. So 7 generations of humans have benefited, and all in all, society has grown hugely in our material wealth, and 1% or 10% of those individuals have grown massively in relation to our current generation wealth, while saddling all future generations with the burden of our benefit. So it's a flaw in our attitude toward nature by externalizing the impact. The other aspect of our attitude toward nature, this third point that I'm making, the other aspect of it is, I think the Bible is pretty clear. This is a more radical point, so take a breath. The Bible is pretty clear that ownership of nature is not a biblical principle. Period. And I'm waiting for the day when a church like this declares itself to be a land trust, and that the individual members of the church begin declaring their private property as land trusts because it is faithless, that is, it is an inadequate expression of Christianity to hold land. I can make that case on a scriptural basis, but I don't have enough time. Fourth point, fiduciary accountability. Humanity has not come to terms with taking responsibility for investing assets in a way that is morally consistent with our responsibility for future generations, or even our responsibility for just a 30-year outlook. If you want to read more about that, a former member of the Security and Exchange Commission, funny name, his name is Beavis Longstreet. Isn't that a great name? Beavis Longstreet. So he is one of many endorsers of my book. You can see his comments on my book in the front pages of the book itself. I heard him speak at Harvard Law School about 4 years ago, and he and I have been buddies ever since. He was a Reagan appointee, and this is his whole point, that it's completely fiduciarily irresponsible for a pension fund to hold fossil fuel stocks. Because if humanity is going to go forward, we must keep fossil fuel in the ground. And if we keep it in the ground, ExxonMobil will no longer be a profitable company. So it is fiduciarily irresponsible, not just morally irresponsible, fiduciarily irresponsible for any pension fund to hold that. Finally, now over the past couple of years, many pension funds have purged themselves of fossil fuel stocks. I'll say more about that in a moment. And the fifth ethical point here is the short time horizon is irresponsible and unacceptable, right? Climate change, more than any other issue, not only exposes the short-term time horizon of our investment practice, but it also exposes, climate change exposes the fact that members of our House of Representatives, they have a 2-year time horizon. Everything they do is related to a 2-year time horizon. That is morally incompatible with the science we have just heard, which has hundreds and thousands of years of impact as a result of the work of 7 generations of humans. So now the second question Greg asked me to speak to is, what are the faith-based considerations, the Christian teachings in particular, that call upon us to take action in relation to climate change? And I want to give you 5 key theological guides for the ways in which God is calling the church to respond to climate change. First of all, and this relates to what I said earlier, with God, there are no externalities. When we have confession in church, we know God already knows this stuff, right? Any understanding of God, no matter what religious perspective, God is omniscient. God knows already. And yet it's important to confess, right? But it's really about us admitting to ourselves. But with God, there are no externalities. So the whole notion of climate denial, right? Think the head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt. The whole notion of climate denial is antithetical to any understanding of God, because you can't lie to God. That's how God is, not who God is, it's how God is. There's no denying truth to God, right? So you all following what I mean? So with God, there are no externalities. We don't get to play games with the science that we have just heard. Second point, God calls communities, not just individuals. Most of us come to church and we think, what is my calling, right? And we have all kinds of conversations about that. Pastors have preached hundreds of thousands of sermons asking their congregation, what is your calling? But it turns out the Bible, much, much more of the Bible, concerns God's call to communities as opposed to God's call to individuals. And one of the things we have to embrace as people of faith in relation to the science we have just heard is that it turns out we've been born on the hinge of history. No other human beings have ever lived when the whole shooting game is at stake. And it's up to our generation to swing that hinge of history toward hope. And the only way that will happen is for us to stop acting as individuals, to stop hearing something like that and feeling unempowered because, oh, I'm only an individual, to stop being an individual and instead to recognize I am part of a community, and this community can leverage our assets and influence and make everything change. So that's the next point. Where am I here? Wait a minute. I have to find my way. There it is. The third point, the third theological point, relates to something I've already said, and that is the earth is the Lord's. It's not ours. Big surprise, right? So it turns out one of the most important things going on, and if you were listening to NPR this morning, you might have heard something about it because the program focused on it, is a lawsuit being brought by 11 young kids between the ages of 11 and 21, who I know personally. And the lawsuit is called Our Children's Trust, and they're suing the federal government, claiming that the Constitution guarantees them a right to a climate not wrecked by the grown-ups. That suit will begin sometime this year. It was first blocked by the Obama administration together with the fossil fuel interests. That block was overcome. Trump came into power. It was then blocked by the Trump administration together with fossil fuel interests. That block was overturned about 10 days ago. This trial will go forward. It will be not just the trial of the century, it will be the trial on which human history hinges. Pay attention. In the United Church of Christ, we have challenged for 1,000 sermons to be preached on that trial and to have them preached by teenagers. Fourth theological principle is that our covenant with God is for all time. It's not just for the current generation with God. It's for all time, and it's not just for human beings. It's for all creatures as well. Look at the 9th chapter of Genesis. It's for all time and all creatures. But what we do is we anthropocentrize that and think, oh no, it's all about me and God. We personalize it. Or it's all about humans and God. No, that's not what Scripture emphasizes, not what our tradition emphasizes. And the final theological principle is the golden rule. Now, all of you know that every religion has as its moral foundation a recognition of the golden rule. That's not exclusive to Christians or Christians and Jews. It's in every single religion. But the problem is, religions got initiated a few thousand years ago, and the idea that treating your neighbor as yourself, that the neighbor might be somebody not yet born, wasn't morally important then because there was continuity of creation. The creation that now supported life would continue contiguously to support life in the future. So my moral obligation was to the person next to me in the pew. That time is over. There is no continuity of creation. That's what they just told us. And as a consequence of that, our generation, as much as we have a moral obligation to others, which we call the golden rule, we have an obligation to future generations no less than the moral obligation we have to one another. All right, now I'm concerned about time.
No, take another 5 minutes.
Okay, so there was one more question that Greg asked me, which is what forms of action are most appropriate for local houses of worship to take? And I want to draw your attention to 5 assets that congregations sometimes you don't frame your life together as overseeing 5 assets. The first one most congregations sort of get, and that is that people are your greatest asset. So I want to challenge any of you that are part of a congregation to consider asking your congregation to make a commitment to become an Acts 2:42 congregation. And if you look at the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 42, you will see that the early church shared all things in common. Now, when I was a local church pastor and I started talking like this, they called me a communist. But it turns out, unless we begin to act like this, not just think, but actually begin to take actions like this, we're sunk. And by we, I mean humanity is sunk. So the first thing to do is, consistent with our Christian beliefs, to become an Acts 2:42 congregation. Consider, providing rides for one another, finding each other, other kinds of sharing that we can do. There's all kinds of ways we can do this. I'm losing time, so I don't want to go into too much like that. Another thing we can do in terms of the people in the congregation is to set aside time in our worship, 1 minute each service, to have a personal testimony from someone in the congregation who that week has done something, made a personal commitment to do something to make the earth more sustainable. Stand up and bear witness. Because here's the truth. The truth is 3/4 of Americans believe, the first slide we saw, that climate change is happening, that it's caused by humans, and that it's getting worse. 3/4 of Americans believe that, and 2/3 of Americans never talk about it. And that's something that church can change if church decides climate change isn't an out-of-bounds political issue we can't talk about. Climate change is center to our faith. The earth is the Lord's. 7 generations of humans have messed it up, and it's our generation that must change that. Well, then the church becomes a safe place in which people, no matter how diverse their views may be, can talk to one another. So let me lead into another idea that's written up in detail in my book. Most of you are familiar with the fact that after South Africa freed Nelson Mandela and he was elected president in South Africa, he and Archbishop Tutu, who by the way had some nice things to say about my book, he and Archbishop Tutu came together to form Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, right? You're all familiar with that phrase. And you may know that their model for Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been utilized in 26 different places throughout the world, places of conflict. Why can't every congregation initiate truth and reconciliation conversations about climate change? People who own ExxonMobil stock, like my 96-year-old stepmom, full confession, my dad worked for 41 years as the head chemical engineer of Mobil Oil. So my stepmom has a lot of Exxon stock. She's a good person, but she needs to work out what she is feeling and experiencing between that reality and my book, right? And shouldn't church be a safe enough place to have that conversation? What good is church in this generation if we can't have that conversation? So I'm urging this congregation and other congregations where you're from to have truth and reconciliation conversations. Maybe I'll leave it at that. I think the Q&A is going to be the most important part of this conversation. So I'll stop there, but I'll welcome your questions. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Jim. I already have some great questions which I'm going to pose to the panelists, but if any of you have written down already some cards, please pass them to the center aisle and we'll collect them at this point, and they'll come up to me. I have already some questions for the scientists. So I'm going to pose one to Tom, one to Meg, and one to John. I think, and given that we have maybe 25 minutes now remaining, I'll ask each of you to just respond briefly.
We should be brief.
Yeah. This one is I'm going to address to Tom. Are we in danger here in Calgary? That is to say, with the sea level rise, I think this is the question that really pertains to some of the work you've done.
Okay, there's other places on Cape Cod which are in more danger than we are. Fortunately, my house is about 100 feet above sea level, so I'm not too worried about that. But all coastal communities on the Cape have areas that are at high risk. Our first responders know where those locations are. And we do have a Coastal Resiliency Commission, I think, that's working now, and they probably will make recommendations. But we do, I think, well, the thing that the poster talks about is not only sea level rise, but the danger that goes with it in terms of hurricanes and so forth, because then you already have high water, and then you have a hurricane surge on top of that. In Buzzards Bay, at one point in time, I think the hurricane of '38, I met a fellow who survived it, and the sea level went up 20 feet there. So hurricanes are the other big challenge I think we're going to have here in Cape. So that, along with sea level rise, are two problems I think we're going to have to deal with.
Okay, thank you. The next one I'll address to Meg, and that is, why is sea level rise not uniform? You want to refer that one to one of your colleagues?
I'm going to pass this over to Tom because I think he has the answer.
Well,
Okay.
one of the reasons are consistent winds in different directions, of course, pushing water up into different areas. Another one is the speed at which ice melts in different regions as well too. And El Nino effects, when there's a lot of warming, the water expands and so forth. It could make a difference. You have a?
Yeah, he was just mentioning that there's a whole bunch of things that affect sea level rise. Some of them are, there have been places that have had glaciers. That's how Cape Cod got here. We're all glacial till. There's still glacial rebound going on. The glaciers geologically left a long time ago, but over geological time, there are places where the land is continuing to rise slowly. There are other places where the land is continuing to subside slowly. So there's just multiple different things. Those two factors, the melting of the ice and thermal expansion of water, those are the two big ones that are going to affect sea level. But then there's all these smaller ones as well.
Great. And now I'll pose this one to John. None of the panelists has talked about projections beyond the year 2100. Of course, this is more speculative, but I think it is important to explain that this will continue to get worse after 2100 because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for centuries. Do you have any comments?
Agreed, it's an important issue. A very recent paper in the journal Science did project beyond that. And it had to do with something that is of interest to ocean scientists, and that is what happens with nutrients in the oceans and how it interacts with what's going to go on if projections are correct with respect to the circumpolar current and production in the Antarctica. So people are looking beyond that, but they haven't done that type of consensus look that you were talking about up to this point. So it's not being ignored, and it is being looked at, and there is active research and active debate with respect to that now.
Okay, great. And this one I'll pose to Jim. With many different religions being practiced worldwide, how can a call to action be made? How can a consensus be created?
There's no problem with that. All the religions regard whatever they understand as holy, whatever they refer to as God. Even the non-theistic religions have myths of creator and creation, and they all acknowledge the earth, what we say as the earth is the Lord's. So that's not a unique to Judeo-Christian tradition. It is a universal recognition. We know better than what we have been doing for the past 7 years. The problem is we just haven't been elevating that knowledge and having our actions conform to that knowledge.
These are great questions, by the way. Thank you very much. I wish I could thank those of you by name, but thank you for sending these along. This is then, I think, for one of the scientists, from a microbial perspective, is that correct? In what ways does climate change impact biogeochemical cycles? Can microbial research lessen the impact of climate change? Sorry if I'm not pronouncing those.
Well, I'll take part of this, but there is active research going on this. One of the things that is happening microbially is, and it's, there are symbionts or organisms that like to live with corals and that like to live with anemones and that like to live with various seafloor organisms. I am not a biologist, I'm a geologist, so please forgive me, any of you biologists out there. Maybe there's someone out there who can answer this. But in actual fact, there is a lot of research going on looking at what the consequences are in the oceans for the increases in temperature and also the decreases in pH, how that's going to affect these symbiotic communities. I don't know how many of you have heard of coral bleaching. When there are high temperatures, you will see all of a sudden the corals, which are normally gorgeous colors, all of a sudden go white. That's not a nice thing. That means that all of those symbionts have died. And then you have other organisms coming in, algal organisms come in and take over. So that's my extent of knowledge. I think there are other people. I don't know if I addressed the question properly.
John, would you like to add?
Well, I would just like to use that as an excuse to point out something that there is a great deal of research ongoing trying to understand the internal carbon cycle in the ocean, which includes the microbial loop, as ocean scientists call it. One of the things that has become very important over the last 10 years or so, maybe 15 years, is the beginning understanding that it's not only ocean acidification that's going to be going on, but there's also a concern about the utilization of oxygen and the spreading of low oxygen areas in many areas of the world's oceans as a result of increased temperature and the resulting changes in the ecosystems.
Okay. Thank you. This one then is to Jim. Most major religious groups have made strong statements about caring for creation. Is there any movement toward religious denominations working together rather than separately to advance caring for creation?
Absolutely. So, for example, we are the only place in the United States where an Episcopalian priest is working for a UCC conference, and she also works for the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, Margaret Bullock Jonas, who is absolutely fabulous. You should get her down here to preach sometime. But well beyond that, I am, being our national spokesperson for our denomination, I am every week in touch with the other leaders around climate issues for the other denominations, and we work together on all kinds of issues. We acknowledge each other's statements in that regard. It's an easy and obvious manifestation of our common beliefs.
Great. This is actually a question I can answer. Will this presentation be available on film? Not on film, but we have recorded today's session, so if any of you would like to